Hello, you're listening to the 805 Uncensored. We're a show on the Anti Capitalist Podcast Network. This podcast covers a variety of topics from music to politics, news, philosophy, and more. There are no limits, which is why we're uncensored, so welcome. And please follow us on your podcast and social media platforms of choice. This is episode number 105, and joined with us today on the show is Joe Payne, also known as Political Payne.
Hey,
How are
hey.
you?
Good, Jordan. Thanks for having me on. And hello, Leslie. You're there too.
Hi there.
Just want to say hi to everybody. Thank you. Thank you for welcoming me on to 805 Uncensored. It's fun to chat with you all today.
Yeah, anytime. So why don't you just start by talking about your channel and your goals for establishing it?
Yeah. Political Payne is an independent journalism project that I started in 2020. I'm from Santa Maria, California. I grew up here in the Valley, Santa Maria Valley. People get weird when you call it the Valley, but I grew up in the suburb Orchid, and it wasn't until I was an adult that I really lived in Santa Maria, and I've lived in the city proper my entire life, or my entire adult life, that is. And through that time, I worked. When I was in high school, I started as an intern at the Santa Maria Sun. That's the weekly, independent weekly. That's the sister paper to the New Times in San Luis Obispo. So that's how I really got into journalism. I learned how to write there. I worked my way up from intern to community calendar editor to arts editor, writing the whole arts section. And then I was the managing editor before I left there in January of 2019. And, I started working on my transfer requirements. I already had quite a bit done at Hancock College. Start there, go anywhere, go Bulldogs. And I transferred to Cal Poly. Start at Hancock, go to the geographically closest and less expensive of the state schools, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, but the pandemic hit, and I'm also just to make it really quick, I do a lot of other things. I'm kind of a Renaissance jackass of all trades, if you will. I'm a musician and a music teacher, and so I tuned pianos. So I was doing, a few different things at the same time. And the pandemic hit, and I was no longer at the newspaper, and I had a lot of online media that I admired, independent online media, and I felt that we're all locked, cooped up, and freaking out, losing our minds. So really, I set out to kind of look at local topics, but also consider and discuss worldwide news. How local news fits into that. I'm passionate about combating disinformation, misinformation. I've always pretty much been on the left. I'm as guilty as many of kind of falling asleep for certain times, and being comfortable in a kind of softer liberalism rather than progressivism or anti-capitalism or leftism, which is probably more where I identify now. I'm definitely more of a social democrat. But Bernie was a wake-up call. All that kind of stuff was swirling around, going on. I was very heavily inspired by the late, great Michael Brooks at the time. So that's really what got me engaged. He was a big inspiration for me going into history. I decided to transfer into history. I'd studied music. I had worked in journalism. So I was kind of steeped in, writing and journalism. And I really wanted to pursue history because I thought it's such an important topic. And you see how it's become politicized. And growing up in Santa Maria, California, you see a lot of, it's a city of more than 100,000 people. Now, when you consider the unincorporated area like Orchid and all the other areas around Guadalupe and other areas, there's got to be close to 200,000 or more people living in the valley of Santa Maria Valley. And there's always this attitude of like, this is a conservative town, look at the rodeo, look at this, look at that. Look at our whatever, the local politicians. This is a conservative town. And through years of reporting as a local journalist, you find that that's just not, It's something people say, and yes, we have plenty of conservatives here. I've known plenty of conservatives my whole life, and still maintain friendly discussions and relations with them. But that's not everybody that's here.
Right.
And so, but because of that attitude, people who lean left in the city, they kind of tend to remain quiet about it. So I thought it was important not just to combat misinformation and provide some journalism and local perspective, but to also just provide a left perspective in Santa Maria and just show, hey, even white boys like me here in Santa Maria Valley are, that you have left-wing people here. And even when you look at, again, as a reporter, you can look at the vote results. The Valley votes majority Democratic when it comes to presidential and congressional politics. So it's just one of those things. I mean, I wrote an op-ed after I got Political Payne going, during the election against the local kook who was running for Congress, right-wing guy, Andy Caldwell. He has he's got like an AM radio show. He's one of those guys, your
Yeah.
local version of Rush Limbaugh or whatever.
Yeah.
And so I wrote kind of a takedown of him when he was running. This is during the pandemic and all the craziness that was going on. And I just had many people come to me and say, "Oh, thank you for doing that." Like, thank you for shredding him like that, because nobody does that around here, or people are afraid to do that.
Yeah.
And so I believe in the tradition of journalism where, you can be a journalist and have an opinion. Yes, you can share your opinion. I did stories that were just, hard facts and reporting, and I can do that. But we all have our biases, and as somebody on the left, my biases are universal human rights, solidarity with working people. I do believe in, and as a leftist, it's not like super hip to jump to defense of liberalism, but seeing that basic tenets of liberalism, like voting, the right to assemble, freedom of speech, these things are under attack from the right wing all the time. Even if you're not paying attention, that's what's going on. And so those things are worth defending. And, we got to be vocal about it, got to do what we can. But so, I've done all kinds of different stuff on my channel. I've done interviews. I've done solo live streams. I went out to the protests. I documented one of the largest protests Santa Maria has ever seen, which is following the murder of George Floyd. Hundreds of people marching through the streets.
Yeah.
I went out to, there was a pro-Trump thing going on Betaravia, and I heard there was going to be some Antifa kids there counter demonstrating, and I went out and documented that. And one of the Trumpers, who I legit recognize this guy from junior high school,
Oh no.
he went to knock this guy's flag out of his hand and took a swing at him, just totally the aggressor. And so that's like one of my most watched videos, because people see a video that says "scuffle at the Trump rally" at Santa Maria, and they go "ooh," and they click it.
Yeah.
So that's a deeper conversation about algorithms and where they funnel us and all that versus
Yes.
the interviews I've done with like the local Indigenous organizing, my cop, the Mixteco Indígena Community Organizing Project nonprofit. You know what I mean? So people don't get as fired up for a longer form interview or stuff like that than they do something divisive. And so I brought that kind of politique. I'm a secular humanist. I believe in humanism. I believe in social democracy. We need to democratize. We get deeper into it. I am an anti-capitalist, and as you mentioned in the opening of your show, and I really did bring that to my studies when I transferred to Cal Poly. Part of why I've been quiet for several years on my channel since I started it, I haven't posted as much, is because I transferred to Cal Poly, and this kind of bridges into my studies a bit. But I brought that politique to my studies, and I had done a story for the Sun in my last year there in 2018, and I thought, oh, it would be interesting to do a local history story, and I started looking up, timelines of some things that happened in local history, and one of them said, oh, 1824, March or February, etc., Chumash revolt.
Ooh.
What? What's that? And for anybody who's grown up on the central coast of California, if anybody who's grown up in California, you remember the fourth grade mission project, right?
Yeah.
The school. Yeah. And everybody, back in our day, it was probably still sugar cube models and styrofoam,
Yep.
build a model of the mission. Did you guys do that?
I absolutely did that.
Of course.
Thankfully, I lived out of state in fourth grade, and I didn't have to do the mission project.
Good for you. Good for you. Well, I think it's third grade is I'm trying to remember. Fourth grade focuses on state history, and it includes the mission project. So Californians learn about the missions. You're in fourth grade, so you get a very fourth grade
Yeah.
version of
Watered down version.
of Spanish settler colonialism in California. And
Horrible.
yeah,
Yeah.
and so and we field trip to the missions, don't we?
We
Yeah.
do.
Yeah, so I remember visiting Mission La Purísima, Mission Santa Ynez, Mission Santa Barbara as a child. I remember we had read Island of the Blue Dolphins, which is a novel written, which was about a real historical person, which is Juana Maria, the lone woman of St. Nicholas Island, or San Nicolas Island, who there's a movie made from it. And
I just read all about that woman. Yeah, can you talk more about that? That's a fascinating story.
yeah, and I cannot remember. So, as a Californian, we all kind of struggle with short-term memory, if you know what I mean. And but so all my exact facts aren't perfect, but when this area was settled, the Channel Islands were just filled with Chumash people, the Santa Barbara Channel, the shore side and the Channel Islands. They had a command of the sea in their tomol plank canoes. They're called tomos. And Juana Maria, for whatever reason, after everybody was removed from the islands, and again, most of the work of Spanish settler colonialism was done by diseases. More than 90%, it's believed, of indigenous people perished just from the communicable diseases that they had no genetic memory of, right?
Terrible.
And so, yeah, and that's horrifying and massively destabilizing. People today cannot comprehend how destabilizing that would be to your society,
Yeah.
to your culture. And they had a civilization. That's how the Spanish recognized it when they got there. The Chumash had a maritime culture. They had a huge array of tools. They were able to maintain linguistic ties across hundreds and hundreds of miles of coastline, well into the interior of the area of the greater area here. And Juana Maria just happened to be lost in the forced removal of Chumash peoples from the islands. And so she was this one last holdout who lived out on San Nicolas Island by herself. And
For
she
18 years.
Yes. For 18
Wow.
years. Yeah. And so I'm trying to correct my camera a bit as I do this, but and of course, within just not long at all, like less than a calendar year of her forced removal to the mainland, she died of a disease. She's buried at Mission Santa Barbara, and because she was kind of known, and it was so late this is after the missions have been secularized, I believe, in 1834, which just means they were no longer under the auspices of the Franciscans and were instead under like a more municipal or you would have a military regent kind of guy, a captain who would preside over the missions. And so, the mission still functioned. The indigenous people weren't bonded to the mission lands anymore, which is how it was. But during the mission period, which is from the late 1700s until 1834, if you were baptized at the mission, born, or you could be a full adult who was born in a Chumash village, but then you become baptized to the mission, you're indentured, you are bonded to the land, you're a serf. So that was the forced labor regime. So Juana Maria was brought back, in the later mission time. And because of that, she's buried in the main kind of graveyard courtyard area of Santa Barbara Mission. So we had read this novel, and then we got to visit her grave, like as kids. And so to me, that kind of stuck out to me, I remember just kind of having a moment standing at her grave, and that was a story that humanized the Chumash and their experience with settler colonialism. And so that kind of always made an impression on me. And it's something that locals kind of understand and know. But yeah, I remember that being formative. And then La Purísima is interesting. Santa Barbara is interesting because it's still maintained by the Franciscans. They never gave it up. Somehow they got to get, because it's the prettiest, best one. They call it the Queen of the Missions. Who would ever want to leave Santa Barbara, right? If you happen to be there. But however, La Purísima is a state historic park. So, and we could dive deeper into that, but La Purísima, if you ever go visit it, it's quite interesting to visit because it's on the outskirts of Lompoc, and it is surrounded by hedgerows and everything that kind of block out the parking lot even, and the highway right there. So you get this visit of like this rural agrarian mission setting. Now, keep in mind, this was a pile of rubble more than 100 years ago, but the Works Project Administration during FDR came through and said, well, let's do a historical restoration. And so the Civilian Conservation Corps rebuilt the thing based on the original mission plans. And so that's what you're experiencing when you go to La Purísima State Historic Park, is literally our modern reproduction of the California missions. Yeah. And so this is very important when we talk about history. History is always an interpretive act, no matter what. Like if you're writing, I call them the elbow patches book, if you're writing your fancy history book where you say the hagiography and the historiography, blah, 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 you're doing interpretation. If you're casting a statue into bronze, you are doing an interpretation. Who are you deciding to make that statue of? Who are you deciding to celebrate? Whose story are you hoping to tell, right? And so, the things have improved in interpretation at La Purísima State Historic Park over the years. I remember being a child and going there, and there would be like an elderly white lady working the loom, and she'd be doing it in character as a Chumash person.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
Things that just at the time, were seen normal, but they have mission life days, where they show you, oh, look, candle making and, this and that. And it really washes over the amount of labor that was done. You had hundreds and hundreds of Chumash people at each mission, and each mission was a imperial outpost of production. They had thousands of heads of cattle, horses, sheep, goats. They are, shearing the sheep, run that loom that I saw, demonstrated. They're making the clothes. The indigenous people are making the clothes. They are they're slaughtering the cattle, tanning their hides. So I wrote a big thesis about the topic we go to. I want to give you room for your next question, and we'll talk about that. But I learned about this as a journalist. I went, how did I not know about it? Nobody around here knows about it? So we all grew up around here, and so I had written that. And then I don't think I'd transferred yet, but I ran into a friend who had come back to town. He had been out of town. It's not like a close friend. I didn't know him that well. And I legit didn't know he's Chumash. He's a tribal member, because he's, like many Santa Marian folks in Santa Maria, he's Latino, but he's also indigenous, and he's his family, his mother and him are tribal members, and his mom had saved that story, and I had saved that issue of the paper, and he said some really nice words to me about writing about it. But then he said, because you got to understand, man, when we all sat around in fourth grade and nothing was said about this, we all knew about it. Like, we all knew about it. We knew our history, and we sat there while this, a whitewash was going on, essentially.
Yeah. It's pretty spectacular looking back on it. Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, I can hog the mic. So interject.
Gotta like press the button or something. So yeah, actually, I wanted to ask you.
Yeah.
Can you talk about, first of all, where the Chumash is in the state of California? Because we have listeners all over the world.
Very cool.
And then the second part of that question too is, how did you become interested in indigenous resistance and decolonial theory, and what does decolonization mean to you?
Yeah. So again, I'm from Santa Maria, California. This is what we call the Central Coast, right? Because we have these goofy stickers that people put on the back of cars that say, not the Bay, not LA. Like, okay, all right, guys, we get it. People might remember like the wine country from the movie Sideways with Paul Giamatti. A couple scenes are filmed here in Santa Maria.
His mom lives in Oxnard.
Who? Giamatti's?
In the movie.
Oh, yes. His mom lives in Oxnard. There's some fun California stuff in that, but Solvang is the little Danish, village. That's San Ynez. That's the mission's right there. The mission's right there. Like, right on the other side of those windmills, where tourist destination is San Ynez Mission, and down the hill from that are the mass graves that they do ground penetrating radar and find all the people that are there. So the Chumash, the Chumash have existed here for millennia, for more than 10,000 years. Before the Clovis discovery, they were the earliest known human remains found in California on the Channel Islands to like 15 to 16,000 years ago.
Is that Santa Rosa Island, right?
It might be, yeah. Again, my recall, but so it's and then the DNA analysis proves that they are the Chumash are part of the original peopling of the Americas, as we call them, right? But so the Spanish don't arrive. So the Chumash, before we get to that, the Chumash area essentially is to the southmost around Ventura, and then they start bordering and intermingling with the Tongva and and other groups, but then they go all the way up to San Luis Obispo, from Ventura through Santa Barbara up to San Luis Obispo.
I know that they're even in Malibu.
Yes, yeah. So yes, and the Chumash would make it all the way to LA, and we have evidence of their why, because again they had these large plank canoes, the Tummel. They would do had incredible ingenuity, make all these tools. They would use the tar that seeps up from the ground. When you drive, Santa Barbara's this beautiful, oh my God, Santa Barbara, but you look out in the channel, it's full of oil wells, right? Of oil platforms. So the Chumash would take advantage of the asphaltum that bubbles up out of the ground, and they would line their baskets with it. They'd line the inside of their tummels with it to make them watertight, and so they were able to they had a all suite of tools for not just fishing, but processing food, for doing their main caloric intake is the oak acorn, which they use mortars and pestles to grind up, and also they have to treat it, to kind of get some of the I can't remember what the you call that type of acidic, toxic stuff that's in it, but they're able to treat the mash that they make and make kind of grind it into a bit of a flour and make almost like a tortilla out of it. And so not only are they able to maintain these ties where we find clearly Chumash artifacts like small carved sculptures, like a rock carved into a whale. Their currency was shells, so they would bead shells. We find these shells, and we find also mussels and clams and all the other things they were eating. We find the evidence of these well into the interior of the area. So if you think of California, Santa Barbara area is where it corners, and it goes. It starts. It's Point Conception is like the corner where you start going from southern to. Again, we call it the Central Coast because we have to have our regional brand identity, right? But I'm trying to. I got off track there for a second. Okay, but so all the way up to San Luis Obispo, but then for miles and miles inland as well. Over these the mountains behind Santa Barbara. That's the Western Transverse Range. So that's the one mountain range in California that goes east-west rather than north-south. You got to go like way back in time to explain how that happened. But on the other side of that mountain range, you have the San Ynez Valley, Cachuma Lake, and Los Padres National Forest, and Chumash villages all throughout those areas, more than 100 miles inland. And it's not until you get to the San Joaquin Valley that you have the Yokut people. And even then, we say Yokut people, but at the time, if you go to the San Joaquin Valley, this massive swath of thousands and thousands of people drive across the Central Valley, right? Take the 5 and you realize, holy, wow, it's a whole lot of flat and a whole lot of the same. That was also peopled with indigenous peoples as well. And they didn't all consider themselves one people. You go in there and say, hey, you're Yokut, right? And they'd be like, no, are you talking about them? We're not, it's like their neighbors. And they're like, yeah, we're cool, whatever. And so, I don't know how to say I got interested in anti-colonial or post-colonial, but I've just always just been interested. I don't know. I've just been interested in the world around me, and always there's always more to learn, and especially with indigenous peoples, it's like I first of all am no expert on indigenous peoples. I'm no expert on even on the Chumash. I have studied this specific point of time during the colonial period because I'm very interested in resistance, revolutions, and subsequently counter-revolutions. But I've learned a lot about the Chumash, but they're just people, anthropologists and historians and the rest who have done so much just on their languages, on the archaeology, on, there was a linguist, what was his name? John P. Harrington, who went all around the United States. But again, who doesn't love Santa Barbara? He spent a lot of time out here in the early 1900s, and he did a bunch of recordings of Chumash peoples on wax cylinders, like used their, these people, a few of them women, Mary Yee was one of them, to explain their words and explain them in Spanish as well, because they were both, or because these Chumash people were bilingual in their indigenous language and Spanish. And this is literally what the Chumash Nation, which is in San Ynez, the San Ynez Valley Band of Chumash Indians, these recordings from wax cylinders are what they are using to reclaim their language, right? See, I
Wow.
knew this would happen. I knew this would happen. So they are using these recordings from the early 20th century to reclaim their language. On the res, I have an interview on my channel with an elder named Marian Para, where she talks about this. But they
I know her.
Oh, very good. Yes, yeah. I think you told me that she's a badass. I gave her a shout out in the acknowledgments of my thesis because I have a lot of respect for her. But the Chumash on the reservation on the nation are doing things like writing children's songs with their reclaimed language to try to just bring it back, and so there's so much scholarship on the Chumash. Again, Santa Barbara is a very affluent area, so the Natural History Museum in Santa Barbara, they have like a full-time anthropologist on staff. They have a full-time ornithologist on staff or whatever. I might have that wrong, but Dr. John Johnson has done work since long before I was born on the Chumash and his scholarship, and him and Marian Para, but also Ernestine Soto, who's a Santa Barbara Chumash elder, because all the Chumash are not the same. There's only one Chumash nation, but there are federally unrecognized groups of Chumash, like in San Luis Obispo area, Santa Barbara, just over the mountains from Santa Ynez. Wow. You're only a member of the Santa Ynez band if you can trace a certain amount of your ancestry directly to the baptismal records of
wow.
Ynez. Yeah. So the more you learn, the more it's like, what, and there is so much of it. But, you learn that, and through my scholarship, I learned that the Chumash were so advanced. They had what we would call a society, what some would call a nation. That's how the Spaniards, when they arrived in 1500 and then really began the conquest in earnest in the 1700s, that's how they recognized it. And there was even some European scholar at the time who was going over all of like the accounts of California indigenous peoples from the explorers, and he like elevated the Chumash to these are the most and this very, very, very problematic civilized of all these heathens were, right, and all the other language you can think of. But it was just out of respect for their technology, their exchange. They recognized they had economy, they had stratified society, they had chiefs, they had priests, they had a shamanic tradition, they had when the Cabrillo expedition came through, they gave those guys more fish than they could eat, more smoked and dried fish than they could even handle. And same thing in 1700s when the Portola expedition came through, which was an on foot expedition, and we have accounts from there was a Franciscan priest there named Juan Crespi, who was walking along with them along the Santa Barbara coast area. They come along to this area, they see these men working on these big canoes or bringing them up onto the shore, or they saw them building canoes, so they say, look, they're carpenters, we shall call this area Carpinteria, right? And that's where my father grew up, is in Carpinteria. And so just learning about that is very eye-opening. But so when they enter Santa Barbara, they this Franciscan is just like, oh, this would be a choice spot for a mission, this would be great, and even though it wouldn't be built for decades, and again, every town they got to, we're talking, when we say a town, I mean like 2,000 people. Some of the Chumash houses, their Tule yurts were like 2 stories. They had like multiple stories built in them, and you have again, people just flooding these explorers, being like, who are you? What are you doing here? Oh my gosh, like, here's some food. What do you have? What do you want to trade? What do you want to do? Let's dance, let's eat, let's party. Like, to the point where they're like, you need to leave. We need to sleep. And so it's really interesting and fascinating. And then again, you can go look at some of the cave paintings that exist where you can kind of learn about, you know, the advanced or the cosmology and the shamanic tradition, or just the spiritual tradition of the Chumash people. So this was a culture and a society that existed for thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of years. And when we place ourselves in time here in 2025, this winter of our discontent, right? They, you know, the massive majority of time on the Central Coast here, it was Chumash people, and they were living in this way. We, you know, Europeans just got here, and in the terms of historical time, and you know, I believe I have a poster here on the wall that helps me where I can see exactly when they were built. But Santa Barbara Mission is built in 1786. And it takes a few years, you know, then La Purísima is built some years after. That's on the other side of the mountains near where Lompoc is, more inland. And then they don't build Santa Ynez till like 1811 or 1810. I might be misremembering. But so, you know, and that mission was built as a further incursion inland into Chumash territory. And that is where the revolution that I write about and have researched begins, is in the more interior, the latest addition to that. So, you know, you have Santa Barbara. The other, when Santa Barbara was built, the other nearby missions were San Buenaventura in Ventura, and then San Luis Obispo in San Luis Obispo, or SLO as we call it locally, right, where I studied at Cal. And so, you know, why do I focus on this? Well, you know, I'm a leftist. I'm you know, whatever. If you go far enough left, some people call me a lib or whatever lib. But you know, I part of my awakening was like reading The People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn.
Oh, brutal. Yes.
Love that book.
Yeah, but it's people's history. It's history from the ground up. It's not great man history. It's
right.
about,
It's just history as it essentially as we think it was. We're pretty sure it was, instead of the washed version we have in school.
Yeah. Well, but I also want to challenge everybody to think about history in this way, where we choose what we interpret in history always.
Yeah.
And so, you know, you can look at any situation, time, or place, and choose what and who and where you want to focus. Why I focus on this is because it's a collective uprising. It's a mass mobilization of these people who were under the yoke of a oppressive colonial, religious, military conquest over their land, over their lives. It wasn't just, you know, there's a lot of slogans today that people repeat, like stolen land, but, you know, people, you know, there was one scholar who is also indigenous activist, you know, called just what happened from disease is a biological holocaust, right?
Absolutely.
So, yeah. So this was dire. This was, and that's how these people experienced it. And as a journalist, I'm always trained to look for the story. Where's the story here, right? And that's what I saw in the Chumash. What was called in history has been called the Chumash revolt. And so when I started digging into the history, it's kind of wild. Some of the main history on this, the oldest history written about this period, was written by Franciscans themselves. Because so the Franciscans are a mendicant order of the Catholic Church. They take a vow of chastity, they take a vow of poverty, but they also have a long scholastic tradition, right? So some of the earliest colleges in the Americas, history always written by the victors, definitely. In this case, they some of the first colleges ever established in the Americas were Franciscans or other orders. But the Franciscans were known for their colleges. If throughout the California mission system and missions across Latin America. Real quick side note, the California mission system is a late iteration of the Spanish colonial missions. And it's only led by one order. The Franciscans, when you had Jesuits, Dominicans, Franciscans across Central and South America, and Greater Latin America, when the California missions are started in the late 1700s, there's already more than a century of mission history.
Mm-hmm.
And for any padre to be in charge of a mission, they have to have gone through their schooling. They have to have gone through one of these colleges. And they really did arrive at missions with a lot of expertise and know-how. They knew agriculture. The Franciscans would study agriculture, resource management, architecture, aqueduct systems. They learned medicine. A lot of the Franciscans, understood basics of what was known at the time. They could reset a broken bone. They could stitch a cut. They could do a lot of that stuff. They were learned in music. They were learned in rhetoric. Guess what? Rhetoric. Franciscans take time every day of study to argue with one another about things, and so they're quite good at rhetoric. And then they also maintain their own history. They maintain their own documents. They maintain their own archives. When I went to look at the documents from this time period, they're maintained at Santa Barbara Mission, which has a mission archive library, because Santa Barbara Mission became one of these colleges later, after the mission period. Because again, who doesn't want to go stay in Santa Barbara and study there? And so, I go to look at these documents. I go to Mission Santa Barbara. I go through, the hallway here. I have to become a member. But then, I see there's a Franciscan in the full robe, but instead of, he's like on a Zoom call these days, like at a conference or whatever, on a Zoom call. But they're very nice guys, and even today they will surprise you with how it all started with Francis, the woke Pope. He messed everything up. No, but they will be very hypercritical even of their own colonial effort today, and it's impressive.
Yeah.
But written at the 100 years ago or more, there was a German-born Franciscan named Ephraim Zengelhard, and he wrote a book about every single mission. He got documents from every single California mission, wrote a book about it. He wrote a book about just all the California missions. He wrote one called The Franciscans in California, and very prolific guy. And then, he has a predecessor, Geiger was his name, and he wrote mission stuff more in the middle of the 20th century. And so this is from the Franciscan point of view. And, he wrote about, so he writes a book about these three missions, one about each three missions. Each book has its own kind of little moment on that. And so, he, what am I trying to say here? I got distracted, but the Franciscans are very like, oh yeah, there was a little revolt, people got upset, but then everything went back to normal. Everything was
no big deal.
Yeah. And so there's a downplaying of these events. And when you look at it, it was the largest armed insurrection against the California missions, led by the Chumash, 3 missions that involved thousands of people mobilizing, militantly and otherwise. And we can get into that. But I recognize that story, and I'm trying to tell it. My thesis is getting a bunch of downloads. I'm really happy about that. But I'm trying to talk about it as much as I can, because this story is a way of really understanding how the missions were and what it was like. Why? Because, first of all, who doesn't love a war story? But also, the missions must have been some kind of way if it impelled and compelled these people to stage a revolution.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So sorry, I could just keep going, but
no, it's fascinating.
Yeah, it's really interesting listening to you talk about all this.
Thank you.
Yeah, I was just saying, We should definitely do a part 2 episode though, because I've just got like 10 more minutes left. But
Okay.
the last question I wanted to ask you before we go is, can you just talk about what it's like being a journalist right now in the modern political climate? Maybe,
Yeah.
yeah. Why don't you talk about that?
Sure. So I didn't, I worked at a free weekly, one of those papers you can pick up for free because it's full of ads. Kind of watched the death of like regular journalism happen. The alt weekly, the free weekly was a bit, could survive the print media death a little longer than, these papers are still around and stuff. But the local daily paper is part of a media conglomerate. The daily paper used to have way more pages. It used to be larger, like had more columns. I remember when I was at the Sun and the Santa Maria Times just stopped coming out on Mondays. We're not doing Monday anymore. Sorry. And so watching media has already been, before the social media era, media had already been conglomerized, corporatized. Everybody, I hope, has seen now that footage of them lining up all the Sinclair broadcast news sites, with all the people repeating the exact same thing like zombie robots, right? So
Scary.
journalism, yeah. And that is corporatization. You're seeing corporatization. But again, right-wing billionaires buying this up. Santa Barbara News Press in Santa Barbara was a well-respected newspaper. It helped spur the modern environmentalism movement with the coverage they did of the oil spill in Santa Barbara Channel in the 70s. And this billionaire, Wendy McCaw, bought it up in I can't remember when, early 2000s or late 90s, can't remember. But the paper slowly deteriorated over time. And lost more and more of its reputation, and continued, oddly enough, hiring journalists that were not asking hard questions, were not posing uncomfortable questions to local governments. If you want a model for what Elon Musk is doing to Twitter or X, buying up an outlet or buying up an outlet that's a place of exchange and a place to challenge power, completely scuttling it and
Buy it up to shut it up.
Yeah, and in shitifying it. And guess what? She bought it so long ago, like decades and decades ago, but only recently did it finally fold, and she just sold it for parts. And even though she might take a loss, that's ultimately what she wanted. So I didn't make friends professionally at this small alt weekly as soon as Trump started calling the press the enemy of the people and all of this stuff. I didn't make many friends by pointing out what that was, and that it was a sign of fascism and tyranny. And, I get it. Anybody who has skepticism towards journalists and the media, I get it. But that's because of capitalism. It's because of corporatization, conglomeration, power. Okay. But journalists, to a person, and this is the thing, it's on all of us to be skeptical human beings. You have to be skeptical, not just of every news outlet. You got to be skeptical of every journalist. You have to be skeptical of every piece they put out. You know what I mean? You got to look at what's going on here. What are they trying to say? What are they not saying? Etc. So I've watched things, and I've watched the newspaper I worked for. There's less people working there. There's less of a paper that used to do a full page spread for the cover story. We called it a 2,000 word deep dive story. They don't do that no more. They just put one of the smaller stories on the cover, and and part of it's the economics, but again, the journalism, we have a double-edged sword with social media, where it's now democratized. We can get on here and talk our shit. I can get on my YouTube channel and say what I want to say, But notice how people self-censor and on social media. Notice how we're all siloed into our bubbles with it. Notice how people are pushed by the algorithm just to make a buck, to survive. All of a sudden, like it's you'll get more clicks as a First Amendment auditor walking with your phone on live and getting a government employee somewhere to go, you can't film here. Yes, I can. And like, while I think there is some merit to that, it's like, that's like, I don't know, the most basic form of like a journalistic, it's like poking something with a stick to get a stimulus response. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But, so like all these incentives, anybody who's going to vilify journalism or journalists, by and large, that's a problem, because there's a reason that shit comes first in the First Amendment, because it's one of the most like vital things just to have a functioning, as dysfunctional as our society is and has been, the freedom of the press and the ability to have a free press, and even guess what? Alex Jones started as a public access radio guy, right? Or a public access television, like, and those things have, even those have disappeared. There used to be a TV station in your town where you could become a member and make your own show because of public access. And that's been eroded as well. So, there's always been this exchange in America. It's also part of, some of the problems that we have. But, I truly believe in that tradition of, I was very much inspired by Hunter S. Thompson to become a writer. He was a guy, problematic, had his own problems, but like, he, even if you're just the voice howling into the void, you can remind people who might feel the same way you do, or are skeptical, that they're not alone, and that we, again, like, why hadn't I heard about this story that the Chumash led the largest armed insurrection in California mission history? Why does nobody know that? Or just people in the know? And I'm trying to change it, but again, it's but yeah, we're under attack. We're hated and vilified. Nobody felt that way when I was the arts editor. Nobody yells fake news at the guy coming to write about your gallery show or review the play. You know what I mean? So like, media and journalism is so many things at the same time. But while we have the opportunity to actually speak our minds, if that will exist for much longer, we have to do it. And and that's the thing. I'm open about my beliefs, where they come from. I unfortunately, I don't recommend this. I asked Google AI to, hey, who's this guy Political Payne and what does he believe? And because I've actually made my what I believe clear, it didn't do a terrible job. It got some things wrong, of course, because it's a soulless, golem of processing power. But I make clear where I stand, what I believe. My as a left person, the world doesn't have to be this way. We don't have to live under the boot of the ruling class. It could be better. It could be different, because it was different, and it has been different, and it could be so. We don't have to accept this maddening world that we live in. We can hope for something better. The only way to do that is to speak it or write it. The pen is mightier than the sword, as they used to say.
Yeah, well said. In the second part of the episode that we do with you, I definitely want to talk to you more about the targeted assassinations of Palestinian journalists. And then also just talk about what the role is of journalism in combating authoritarianism and fascism.
Yeah, there's a war on the truth. It's been ongoing. And when you study history, you realize, oh, this has been going on long before since I was born. This struggle has been ongoing. And that's why we sing the songs. That's why we sing the old songs from yesteryear, and you have to connect with your own history. You have to connect with your local history, or you don't have to do anything, but you should try to connect with history and understand that it's, Howard Zinn, history is a moving train, and you cannot be neutral on a moving train. We got something pushed us to where we're at now, and you have to contextualize that. I have ancestors baptized at the missions that were here on the Central Coast when this was Mexico. So
Wow.
the story of settler colonialism is in my history.
Mm-hmm.
So it's something that we can't shy away from. It doesn't hurt me to admit that either. It's like we have to. So many people see history and journalism as an assault on their closed dogmatic worldview, but that's why they hate us, because we actually speak truth to power and challenge it. So they hate you for that. So
that's right. That's exactly
and
right.
that's what you see in Palestine clearly is it's settler colonial erasure, just like was done here in California. Just because now you see it on your phone. That's what's truly dystopian and horrifying about it, but also in a way revealing about our times is you see it on your phone. Imagine if we'd seen Rwanda like right in front of us. Imagine if you'd seen Bosnia Herzegovina or the Holocaust of World War II.
Yeah.
That's the world we live in, and that's where it's really hard to not get blackpilled. But if you have a foundation of fundamental human rights and realize that this is a struggle that's been ongoing long before you and I were here, and that it's up to us to pick up the torch and keep it going, then maybe you can sleep at night after witnessing all the horror.
Yeah,
I think that's a really good way of ending the episode. Well said.
Thanks, Jordan. Let's do a part 2. We can get more into the details of the rebellion too, or the revolution as I defined it in my thesis. I'd love to do that sometime.
Yeah, that would be great. Let's talk offline and we can nail down a date.
And I would appreciate any likes and subscribes at Political Payne on YouTube, or I just started posting TikToks if I'll be allowed on there after the U.S. takeover's done. And I'm on Instagram, Facebook, of course, and Blue Sky. I don't spend much time on X. So
sounds good. Appreciate your time, man.
Appreciate you for having me on. Thanks, guys.
All right, have a good rest of your night.
You too.
Bye. As always, the 805 Uncensored is on all the major social media and podcasting platforms. If you have any questions, comments, guest ideas, shoot us an email, 805uncensored@gmail.com, or message us on social media. We'd love to hear from you. All right, have a good night, everyone. Stay safe out there. Free Palestine. Revolution is you. Bye.
Vive la revolution.
Bye, Leslie.
Bye.
Nice to meet you.